Welcome to our afternoon session. Historic figures, of course, cannot choose their biographers. But if they could, I fancy that John Wood Oman would have been delighted to know that the Reverend Fleur Houston was to be his biographer. In many ways, she is so well equipped for this role. An alumna of Westminster College, and as she writes in the foreword to the book, it was her fascination with the portrait of John Oman that she saw so often, no doubt, from the dinner table that first intrigued her to find out more about this very fascinating man. A true Scot. Another thing that I think Oman would have been fascinated and pleased by, a very gifted linguist and somebody with a great passion for and interest in all the countries of continental Europe. A creative and ecumenically minded theologian, a good preacher, someone who has brought words and a living story to his portrait. Thanks to the pandemic, all the initial notes and stories and gathering and working through archives of material that Fleur, and we mustn't forget her great aider and abettor, Walter, too, had been able to do. All that initial work was put to final work in the chapters we now have in the book through the space that she was able to use in the time of COVID. And she has put them together into a very lively and engaging but scholarly piece of work. Rich, I'm sure you'll agree if you've already engaged with it, in plenty of historical references. And she paints for us in each part of Oman's life a sense of understanding not just the man himself, but those around him and what was happening for others of his generation. So without taking up more of your time, I just want to refer quickly to a quotation from the foreword to the book, which resonated for me as I read it, and I think fits particularly today because it also references another person from our society, Professor Clyde Binfield, who, as Fleur writes with typical modesty, was somebody who guided her in the early stages. She writes of Clyde that he read and commented on the first 8 chapters. From the outset, he gave me grounds to think this project was worthwhile and generously encouraged me to proceed. And I don't think anybody who's engaged with Fleur's book can differ from that very wise opinion. So thank you, Fleur.
Kirsty, thank you very much indeed for those kind words. I scarcely recognise myself. I would like also to thank the Council of the History Society for inviting me to give this lecture on John Wood Oman. I'm honoured, and it's a special pleasure for me today, of course, to be here in the church when so many years ago I was myself ordained to the ministry. This church and this congregation taught me a great deal about what ministry meant and involved. As we see from that fine display which Margaret Hall has mounted in the back wall, St. Andrew's Church has a very distinctive history, and John Oman led worship here on one occasion during his time as moderator of the Presbyterian Church of England. You may also note that it has a very contemporary claim to distinction. There must be very few, if any, URC churches which can boast of an Ethiopian tabot as part of their liturgical furnishings. As an introduction this afternoon, I would like to say this. If you are looking forward to a scholarly exploration of complex issues of theology and philosophy, you're going to be disappointed. Much ink has been spilled on the relationship between faith and freedom over the years, and doubtless there'll be much more over the years to come. I'm not proposing that we make any attempt this afternoon to further the debate. But I am rather employing a method that is grounded in Oman's experience of historical reality, addressing faith and freedom through this, rather than making them my primary focus. I shall first discuss the ways in which the circumstances of Oman's early life endowed him with a vast responsiveness to the intellectual environment, stimulated an aesthetic response to philosophical and theological issues, and nurtured a capacity for human sympathy and understanding. Then I shall present two episodes, different in character, which show how profound life experiences in different contexts insinuated themselves into the formulation of Oman's thought. Next, we will consider how Oman experienced the sorrow and wickedness of war as an amalgam of thought and experience. How writing on these things was in itself a rich and ongoing life experience. I shall then argue that for Oman, post-war reconstruction required a vision of something more above and beyond appearances, the need for larger experience beyond what merely exists. And in all this, I'm being rigorously selective, both in the experiences I reference, there could be so many more, and the books which I cite. Let me share with you now a conversation between two men on a dreary autumn day, apparently about issues of theology. It was, Hugh Sinclair remembers, tough, wearisome, unprofitable. They appeared to be getting nowhere. Then he continues, my friend tossed an unpretentious-looking volume at me across the table. Read that, he said, somewhat testily, and we'll talk about the matter again when you're through with it. And begin anywhere you like, it doesn't matter where, because it's a kind of book that has neither beginning nor middle nor end, but it's full of stuff. I glanced at the title, Sinclair said, Vision and Authority by John Oman, and ventured to ask who John Oman might be. John Oman, was the impatient response. Do you mean to say you've never? But he was far and away the strongest. Yes, positively brilliant and provocative to a degree. I remember him discussing, but there, what's the use when you don't know the man? Read that book and you'll find you've knocked up against something. Hugh Sinclair concludes, I read the book, and amongst many impressions it made upon me, the sense of having knocked up against something remained dominant. It would appear that the discussion they'd been having that day had been grindingly uninspiring until John Oman and his book came into the equation. Then something emerged to change the situation. But what was that something? This had to be something more than words and concepts. The writer was somehow present with his experience and beliefs. He was a living voice. He was speaking with the reader through the rich stuff that emerged from the printed page. So who might this person be? Who was John Oman? On the assumption that at least some of you are in the position of the hapless young man who had never heard of Oman, there are some statements we can make about him. He was born in Orkney in 1860. His student career at Edinburgh University was crowned by a first-class degree in philosophy, followed by formal preparation for the ministry of the United Presbyterian Church, which included terms at the universities of Erlangen and Heidelberg, with a visit in passing to Neuchâtel. He exercised pastoral ministry for 17 years at Clayport Church in Alnwick as a minister of the Presbyterian Church of England. During this time, he married Mary Blair, with whom he was to have 4 daughters. From Alnwick, he was called to Westminster College, Cambridge, as Professor of Systematic Theology and Apologetics, and subsequently as Principal. He was actively involved with the Faculty of Divinity and the first Westminster professor to hold a university post. Some of this time was taken up with war work, notably with the YMCA, and after the war, he was engaged with efforts at reconciliation by the churches. He died in 1939, honored by church and academy, and mourned by a great many people. Of his publications, The Problem of Faith and Freedom in the Last 2 Centuries, Grace and Personality, and the Natural and the Supernatural, consolidated an international reputation. And yet, such a summary of the bare facts of Oman's life does not at all capture the living, dynamic voice of personal experience. So come with me now to mainland Orkney in the 1860s. Oman was born in a small farm named Biggins. But if we were to assume that his life was a log cabin to White House experience, nothing could be further from the truth. His father was far from the apocryphal humble farmer needing to know how to plough a stony field, as has been supposed, but an astute businessman, a skilled farmer, and a person of status in the community. He was a warm-hearted neighbor and a bountiful and generous friend to those in need, and he knew the value of education. Thanks largely to his initiatives, the Oman children, James, Margaret, John, Isabella, Simon, and Thomas, received excellent basic schooling in Stenness. And for further education, they were enrolled, or some of them at least were, with a tutor in Stromness. Although details of the curriculum there are sparse, Oman tells us that by the age of 14, he was immersed in reading Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. As a young man for whom a problem was a provocation, he matriculated at Edinburgh University with a well-stocked mind, with anything but an insular intellectual outlook, and more important still, with his native gift of original thought unimpaired. From an early age, his environment stirred his reflective mind. When you are in Orkney, he wrote sometime later, you will see land and water intermingled, the sea a perfect azure, and the hills every shade from brilliant green to dark brown and purple, and gaze without interruption from horizon to horizon, and watch the changing shadows cast by the brilliant white light, and breathe the vast air. From his childhood on, the depth of the sky left him with a sense of infinity, He illustrates this memorably. "I had been to church," he writes. "I think the preacher had been expressing the absolute difference between good and evil under the material forms of heaven and hell. I went down to the edge of the water alone and stood, a very small child, with the full tide at my feet. Along the smooth waters of the Sound, a path of sunshine carried the eye out to the open sea. It flashed upon me that if I dropped in and floated out, with endless sea around, I should be alone for ever and ever." His environment also nurtured an intuitive understanding of other people. He lived amongst simple stay-at-home people and some far-travelled folk and wandering gypsies, the seafarers, the old woman who saw fairies at the bottom of her garden, the gypsy whose character was of very mixed shades of grey downwards, the scholarly young head teacher, the devout and prayerful elders in the UP church in Stromness, the very gracious old gentlewomen whose memory came back to him like a scent of clover across the sea. All these cultivated an apprehension of human life which animated so distinctively his relationships with his flock in Alnwick, his students in Cambridge, the soldiers in YMCA camps and hospitals on the Western Front, and contributed to the appeal of his writings. Since the first longships came out of the East, this was a land of seafarers and adventurers, a place where, to quote Oman, men went to sea and muffs stayed at home. From the early 18th century, the Hudson Bay Company took on men from Stromness until they were superseded by the whaling industry. These were accustomed to pitting their energies against the sea. Men like Oman's father, Simon, one of the thousands of young men from Orkney who sailed to the Davis Strait in search of whales. But Simon Oman was ambitious. By industry, application, and dint of perseverance, he qualified as a master mariner, and somewhere around 1863, long after he had married and inherited the farm of Biggins, he became captain of the Royal Mail, plying across the Pentland Firth. And the Pentland Firth could be rough. The Atlantic and the North Sea invading each other's domain twice a day, raging back and forth through the narrow channels and sounds, to quote George Mackay Brown, and the fickle wind can be foe or ally. There were many shipwrecks, many widows and orphans, but John, between the ages of 8 and 17, regularly navigated a yole, which is a type of flat-bottomed boat typical of the Orkney. He navigated this boat across the Bay of Ireland to Stromness for lessons with his tutor. When neighbours expressed concern about a child, and not very old a child at that, undertaking so dangerous a crossing, Simon is said to have expressed utter confidence in his son's ability to handle the boat. He was free to do so. Up to the age of 15, Oman told his students, my chief ambitions were to sail a boat in a gale and ride a horse barebacked. He lived within a seafaring community, and he knew that the first at least of these ambitions courted danger. But he also perceived that such exposure to the sea gave rise to a strong belief in divine providence. To quote one of his sermons published in 1921, when troubles roar like the roaring of the sea, and the light is darkened in the heavens, and counsel perishes from the wise, The only wisdom available is to stand in our place and look up into the face of the great steersman of the world's bark, who alone knows its course and its port. So when I chose as the title of this paper, Navigator of Faith and Freedom, I used navigator as a metaphorical indication of an attitude of mind and experience with which Oman was imbued from his childhood. We come now to the first example of two experiences which insinuated themselves into his thought long term. Oman writes in his preface to the first edition of Vision and Authority that when he started to write, he had no thought beyond the more practical issues of the present ecclesiastical situation, but that it had grown to be an inquiry into the foundations on which all churches rest. What was implied by the reference to the present ecclesiastical situation? When Oman went to university at the age of 17, the Free Church controversy over historical criticism was at its height. Oman was not himself particularly disturbed about the issues raised. He appears to have taken it for granted that a person might hold firmly to a belief in the inspiration of Scripture while entertaining scholarly views about the authority, dates, and unity of the books of the Bible. The United Presbyterian Church, which a friend once described to me as the branch of the church that Oman held onto, had over the years come to the understanding that a faithful reading of the Bible was perfectly compatible with historical criticism. This is the approach Oman would have imbibed as a child in the pews of the church in Stromness, and a young man during his student days at Edinburgh University, when he was an active member of the UP Student Society. He had no quarrel with the Free Church, but he was profoundly disturbed by his perception that a church might lack integrity and that truth might be obscured by an exercise of ecclesiastical authority. These were the circumstances. In 1870, William Robertson Smith, the brilliant young professor of Oriental languages and Old Testament exegesis in the Free Church College, Aberdeen, accepted an invitation to contribute articles on biblical criticism, especially of the Old Testament, to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Reactions by influential people in the church were immediate and they were hostile. And in 1877, a report alleged heresies and errors. There followed a succession of trials in various ecclesiastical courts, and before long, what was known as the Robertson Smith case was shaking the land. Finally, on the 24th of May, 1881, Smith was deprived of his chair of Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis, using the arguably illegitimate invention of the Assembly's reserve power. The grounds given were, it was no longer safe or advantageous for the church that Professor Smith should teach in one of her colleges. His teaching, however, was not condemned, and he retained his ministerial status. Many people felt that this judgment betrayed a lack of integrity. Young Oman was scandalized. He perceived that the church was more concerned with unanimity than veracity. As he understood the matter, the judges in the case were so far from being seekers after truth that they wouldn't have recognized it if they'd met it in their porridge. It affected him, he says, as a call to his life's work. His mind was questing, his idealism active. He was left with no option between facing the search for truth, a truth which would shine in its own light in face of all inquiry, and complete skepticism. Whereas this was a time when many able men abandoned their theological course because they felt their faith could not be reconciled with scientific and scholarly discoveries, and others were imperturbed. Oman was one of those who felt the difficulty acutely, but determined to grapple with it in the faith that, however painful and costly the struggle might be, the ultimate gain would far outweigh the loss. Vision and Authority, published in 1902, when Oman was ministering in Anik, was an honest record of that search. At a time when all authority had been questioned, and no one seems quite sure what things that cannot be shaken remain, Oman wrote a book of hope and encouragement for church people, for ministers and ordinary people, which compels them to look beyond institutions that may be challenged to the things that know neither decay nor defeat. In that Vision and Authority was geared to a popular readership, Oman aimed to express religious thinking as far as possible in ordinary language. Otherwise, as he said, it's apt to be in the air and end in abstraction. The Robertson-Smith affair convinced Oman that authority in the church could be exercised in such a way as to suppress freedom. After much reading and reflection on the subject, he concluded, "The old external authority of the church is a halting place we have in God's wise providence long past, and by no preaching of submission can it be found again. The demand which should ever ring more loudly in our ears is to inquire more earnestly, more humbly, more patiently, more utterly in the spirit of love, and with a more exclusive regard for the interests of truth." We come now to the second example of a profound personal experience which fed into long-term theological reflection. This time the context was primarily political, and the issue, freedom of conscience. On grounds of conscience, Oman vigorously and publicly opposed successive government measures to reform the education system. This was long overdue. Although in 1895, the new Conservative Liberal Unionist coalition government, under the leadership of Lord Salisbury, had made an attempt, the resulting Education Bill of 1896 aroused the wrath of nonconformists in and out of Parliament and had to be withdrawn. Oman was passionately opposed, claiming a more retrograde and brazenly party and sectarian measure than this bill has not been offered to the country since it became in any sense constitutional. 6 years later, in the teeth of the same raging opposition, similar legislation was approved. That's the way it is. The so-called Balfour Act established a new system of secondary schools. The old board schools were abolished. And most controversial of all, nonconformists were being required to pay rates and taxes to schools whose religious instruction, be it Anglican or Roman Catholic, was repugnant to their conscience. They were being forced, Oman claimed, to pay for inculcating the crude material idea of the Mass. With crusading zeal, he set about forming a free church council in Anik to foster solidarity in opposition to the act, and was at the forefront of a local ecumenical campaign of civil disobedience. In June 1903, he refused to pay the education rate of threepence in the pound. Along with the local Baptist and congregational ministers and a local councillor, he was summoned by the parish overseers. As he stood in the dock, Oman pled conscientious objection. On his refusal to pay the order of £1.15, a distress warrant was issued, and under cover of dark, 2 walnut easy chairs in leather were taken from his house to the auction rooms. They were sold for 17 shillings and sixpence and 14 shillings, respectively. A few weeks later, he addressed an indignation meeting in Alnwick Town Hall, where he explained his motives to an enthusiastic audience. Our action in refusing willingly to pay a rate is so inconsistent with our usual behaviour as loyal citizens that we have felt it right to give our fellow townsmen an opportunity of hearing our reasons. So he lists grounds for protest, the first being political. One must recognise that only the ancient party of privilege could have passed this measure by foreclosing debate, and thereby making mockery of representative government. There is a limit to human endurance, he continued. Even the worm will ultimately turn. Freedom is at stake. On the day that minorities cease to set limits to their coercion, on the day they will no more suffer for their convictions, on the day majorities think they can ride over everyone's rights and everyone's conscience, on that day, majority rule will end and give way to the easier rule of an autocrat. And he continues, unless there are some few at least who value justice above goods and liberty above life, no community will long remain free. Ultimately, he asserts, the grounds for resistance to the rates were religious, and religion never was forwarded, never was anything but wronged and misrepresented by any association with injustice. Oman understood that the state was exercising authority in a way that infringed its obligations to justice, and that this was a challenge to democratic freedom. In a democracy, personal identity must involve freedom, including the freedom of a dissenting minority. How does the authority of the state in a democracy impact on the freedom to resist? Whose freedom does the state serve? Under what circumstances is a person of conscience justified in challenging the law of the land? Oman was to be sued again for non-payment of the education rate, and his goods distrained on 2 other occasions, in March 1904 and March 1905. By 1906, the movement nationally and locally was beginning to lose momentum, and for Oman, the raw energy of that episode was being transmuted into more scholarly pursuits. His intense engagement in political protest coincided not only with the concentrated demands of pastoral ministry, but also with a period of strenuous academic work. On the 13th of March 1904, he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Philosophy by the University of Edinburgh for a thesis entitled Rationalism and Romanticism, a study of Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone, and Schleiermacher's speeches on religion. The following month, he delivered a series of lectures at Westminster College with the heading, Some Inherited Problems of Theology. These were a first outline of the Kerr lectures he was to give in Glasgow in January 1906 in the United Free Church College. For an audience consisting largely of theological students, he explored what he described as the ultimate problem for theology: how faith is to be absolute and freedom absolute, yet both one. Well aware of the ambitiousness of the task before him, he comments, "My rashness, I suppose, can only be defended on the principle that the one defeat that is wholly disgraceful is to be afraid of the battle." His survey of selected theologians of the previous 2 centuries raised radical questions. Should religious faith be fixed and immutable, or should it engage responsibly in free, ongoing inquiry? Are faith and freedom opposed to one another? Oman concludes that while he had no logical scheme of history to offer, no account of uniform progress, the long struggle had made it plain that true faith, so far from being in hostility to freedom, is impossible without it. He was himself to continue to contribute to the struggle throughout life. The book of the lectures, published under the title The Problem of Faith and Freedom in the Last 2 Centuries, made an immediate impact, led to a lecture tour in America, and marked the author out for important professorial work. As Oman saw it, the long struggle was dynamically bound up with human experience. "It's a sad hindrance," he wrote, "to our progress, that thinking has to be done by thinkers, for it is virile action and not the dust of books that makes men. The thinker is perhaps rather in the position of the fly on the carriage wheel, doing less to advance the world than he supposes. The field is vast. A thinker is not a person with a bag into which he collects so many ideas from other people and adds so many more of his own. The real interest is to see a man's attitude towards the great elemental truths, to see what interest predominates for him, and from what point of view he regards the world. It's not, as in the physical sciences, an account of adding one discovery to another, but of an advance in conscious grasp of the whole bearings of the problem through the continual pressure upon it of thought and living interest. This feeling of life is the difficult and the important thing to retain." Oman perceived his engagement with the Robertson Smith affair and the campaign of passive resistance to the Education Act as experiences of the abuse of authority, in the first example ecclesiastical and the second political. In each case, they inspired Oman long-term to reflect on wider issues of faith and freedom. We turn now to investigate how the war years were an amalgam of thought and experience. In 1915, Oman was invited to give an address to students of Queen's College who were having to determine how they should respond to the war effort. For his own benefit, he expanded it and agreed to its hasty publication with the title The War and Its Issues, in the hope that it would in some way help towards a better solution. This remarkable little book is one of the very few where he applies his thinking directly to concrete issues. For example, pacifism, he maintains, is not enough. So long as our social and economic system is exploitative, all who live for position, money, or any kind of material power are involved in the tyranny of immoral force as much as if they were fighting in an unjust and predatory war. As to the claims of national service, Each individual is given the spirit by which he can adequately deal with his own interests according to his own sense of duty. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that book was not well received. The Presbyterian Messenger reacted strongly to Oman's radical critique of the church. Listen to what he says. Even the churches wealth less frequently frequents are largely governed by men of an armchair habit of body and a banknote habit of mind. The same in type at least as those who make wars and never fight them, who demand of our churches success as worldly organizations. Hence, much concern about numbers, funds, and organizations, and very little about truth and love. Instead of having a gospel for the poor, for man in his nakedness and need, the comfort is only for the already comfortable, the riches of grace only for those who already possess. The political content was also controversial. His refusal to be drawn into hatred of Germany, his belief that German imperialism was not far removed from Britain's in the age of Queen Victoria, his dislike of secret diplomacy, and his perception that war was turning Britain into a military and authoritarian state, his thoughts on the need to create a just peace, all of these were opposed to the thrust of public opinion at the time. However, when in 1917 Oman published a work of theology, which was The Effect of the War, it was immediately ranked as one of the greater treasures of theological literature. His election as principal of Westminster College was clinched when it was reported that P.T. Forsyth, the distinguished Congregationalist theologian, was found reading it on his deathbed. The work was Grace and Personality. In the preface, Oman writes, "The war scattered my students, interrupted more directly historical and philosophical studies, into which an appointment to the university lectureship on the philosophy of religion at Cambridge had led me, sent me into camps and hospitals where fundamental religious questions were constantly being addressed, and forced upon me the reconsideration of my whole religious position. The fact that such sorrow and wickedness could happen in the world became the crucible in which my whole view of the world had to be tested." What was the truly Christian view of the relationship between God and the world? As his purpose was to convey a view of the world which should include this and other events in time, he sought to avoid direct reference to the war, which might divert the mind from that larger issue. But at the same time, he knew that given his personal experience of the war, it was impossible to disassociate himself personally from what he wrote. That experience was intense, and it was varied. He provided the services of a Presbyterian minister at the first Eastern Hospital in Cambridge. He visited UK prisons and internment camps. He accompanied students to serve the YMCA in Bedford and in base camps in France. And he himself went out for some months as a lecturer with the YMCA. He attended labs, dying and casualty clearing stations, debated theodicy with soldiers and matters of conscience with students. He mourned the deaths of friends, students, and members of his extended family. What did it mean under such circumstances as these that God was in the world, reconciling the world to himself? as Oman, rooted in the immediacy of war, addressed the question, he came up with a radical reconstruction of the doctrine of grace, bringing together an utter dependence on God with utter moral independence. He defended his method in his preface to the revised edition of 1919 in these terms. As one with a 4-year habit of military metaphor expresses it, it means going over the top and not caring a hang what is to happen. It means that for action as well as thought, and for both of these inseparably. But until discovery is made that no final victory either for truth or righteousness ever can be won, except in the open country of the Spirit, that venture is mere bravado. So long as the business of religion is thought to be with traditional faiths and accepted customs, and the business of theology is to erect sandbags of learning upon their parapet, it will ever seem the essence of unbelief in what God has done. It's impossible, he continues, to remain in the entrenchment of outward authority and be in the open country of action and inquiry at the same time. The impact was huge of this book. Although it was judged heretical, and vigorously judged heretical by evangelical scholars, particularly in the United States, John Hick spoke for many who, like him, were immersed in a highly conservative Calvinist theology. It taught me, he said, that God is not primarily omnipotence and judgment, but personal grace and love. The discovery for John Hick and for many others was life-changing. Now we come to the post-war years. A correspondent in the British Weekly records how, in August 1914, he met Oman along with some other friends on the shore at Warkworth in Northumberland. Oman addressed him like this: "Well?" And later, "Chaos has come again. I feel that never will you and I look upon a world recognizably like anything we have known." In The War and His Issues, he foresaw that at the end of the war, there would be a severance with the past, when those of us who are not prepared to reconsider all our judgments and helped to build a new heaven and a new earth will not be able to retain the old, but will only wander in the new time as shadowy ghosts of a vanished past. The chaos of the First World War inaugurated a time of transition, an interim period when people were expelled by old forms by war and rapid economic change, but had not yet found their feet in the new structures. What was the role of religion in the flux of becoming? In August 1923, Oman delivered his inaugural address as principal of Westminster College. He stated to the Presbyterian Church Assembly his conviction that belief in providence is the nerve and sinew of all religious faith, not only because it depends on the world as it is, but on reconciliation to a purpose above it and beyond it. No realization of this is possible within the limits of our earthly life, but its hope rests on finding in the eternal purpose with the world the power of an endless life, and not on any demonstration about the future. A perception that the Church had a key role to play in post-war reconstruction intensified Oman's belief that the best way forward was together. Might a lead now be given by the World Alliance for Promoting International Friendship between the Churches? Oman certainly thought so, and he would generally have assented with its professed aim to breathe into the League of Nations a living soul, not to handle politically those great issues which the League had to deal with, but to make public opinion so powerful on Christ's side that the monstrous arbitrament of war should not be used again. Those aims were, in Oman's experience, immediately put to the test. Let me explain. Relations between France and Germany had been increasingly tense since the 11th of January 1923, when 5 French army divisions and 1 Belgian division marched into the Ruhr. France was determined to claim her due in coking coal, dyestuffs, and money in response to Germany's defaulting on reparation payments. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with a concerted campaign of passive resistance by Ruhr industrialists, mine workers, and railway employees. No action was taken by the League of Nations, as this invasion was technically legal under the Treaty of Versailles. But how was the alliance to provide a moral impetus for peace? On the 3rd of August 1923, as the situation reached crisis point, 3 men met in Düsseldorf. 2 were Lutheran pastors from Sweden, Sam Stadner and Alfred Wilborg. The 3rd and most senior was John Oman. Their stated aim was to visit the French prisons in the Ruhr in order to take consolation and religious support to the German prisoners. The visit was under the auspices of Nathan Söderblom, Archbishop of Uppsala, and chair of the Swedish Council of the Alliance. But we can only guess why and how Oman was chosen as one of the little delegation. One thing we could be certain, however, was that he would have found travel to Düsseldorf extremely challenging. Many of the prisoners whom the men were to meet had been implicated in passive resistance. Others, kept in solitary confinement, were regularly sentenced to death for acts of sabotage, and frequently that sabotage involved the railways. As the report of the visit implies, the prisoners did benefit from the moral and spiritual support provided by the 3 men. Oman was regarded somewhat as Noah's dove. He was approachable, and he was fluent both in French and German. He observes, "Being less clerically adorned than the others, I think the prisoners spoke more freely to me. In no case had I the least difficulty in getting into conversation at once." He talked freely with all types of prisoners, from Baron Krupp to a small boy taken up for stealing. "Usually," he writes, "I was met with the warmest sympathy. Some said they'd no hope except in working for Christian principles. Some even thought that military dominance was a danger in itself. But not all. A police officer is reported as having said, 'The ministers spoke of love. I would have preferred that he spoke of hate.'" Oman also records conversations with numerous non-prisoners, notably the French High Commissioner and a German superintendent and professor of fine art. Despite some positive outcomes of the visit in terms of prisoners' welfare, Oman wrote afterwards to Söderblom that it's a seemingly hopeless situation. The French talk like reason and moderation incarnate, but France is for them the universe. Germany is being thrown back on force as the sole remedy. It's the old story of Athens and Sparta, every Athenian a liar and every Spartan a brute. Our policy may have been wrong, he's quoting, but it's patriotism not to admit it. There's a recognition here by Oman of insincerity, of disregard of justice, of truth, brought home to him here, not by ecclesiastical affairs, as they were in the Robertson Smith case, but revealed in a political context. There's an element of vexation in Oman's words. His visits to the prisons with Stadner and Wilberg seem to have brought home to him the limits of what was possible for the Alliance to achieve. Were the goals of such a visit to gain concrete outcomes? Were they to facilitate a better understanding of the value of faith in the lives of those with whom they spoke? If so, it would appear from the report that both aims were amply achieved. However, Oman's reaction in his letter to Soderblom reveals an essential aspect of a faith perspective. We participate in the public sphere as human beings because certain things matter to us, and certain things are more significant to us than others. In Oman's case, as we see throughout his adult life, integrity, sincerity, and truth matter. This raises the question, if one accepts the need for religious faith to be rooted in present experience, what are the realities to which it must respond? And how does faith respond to these realities? Oman's visit to the Ruhr and the Rhineland in 1923 brought home to him the fact that the Alliance was, as it stood, incapable of taking the universal perspective that was, in his view, a prerequisite for a moral stance for peace. It has, as he put it, not yet seen its vision or found its own soul. What shape might that vision assume? A short time before he set off for Dusseldorf, Oman had summarized his views on the religious dimension of human experience in his inaugural address as Principal of Westminster College as follows: "The business of theology is to deal with life and actual experience, but to deal with these as they speak of things beyond demonstration, things or moments of deeper insight and higher consecration." And a few years later, in the preface to the second edition of Vision and Authority, he illustrates this vividly in a parable, where he writes of the authority of the double vision, of the near and changing, of the remote and abiding. Returning home one night, late, from a visit to a friend, he was crossing the Northumbrian moors when this parable suggested itself to him. Suppose yourselves on a wide moorland, without anything very distinctive at any time in any direction, and in the dark, totally without character or feature or visible landmarks, with the mist settling in the boggy hollows and a somber heaven above, with too few stars for any one to be identified with certainty. If, being accustomed to such a situation, you are still calmly assured that you'll reach home safely and even directly, to what guidance are you trusting? You might say the beaten track, gradually unfolding in front of you. It's useful as far as it goes, but you can't commit yourself to it entirely. When it forks and goes in different directions, what then? You have to decide which way you take. And when you find that it diverges from the right direction, then you have to take the risk of leaving it and heading in the right direction as best you can. At this point, the guidance of what you see on earth becomes only the more important. The little space you can see in front of you ensures that you place your feet carefully, and the vague outline that grows clearer as your eyes become accustomed to the dark enables you to keep to the higher ground and avoid the bogs and the mists. But this use of sight for what is near is not enough. It has to be combined with a sense of general direction from what is not near. The far horizon is outlined against the lighter sky, and there is a solitary star, the name of which you may not know, but the direction of which you may confidently trust. Wisdom, reason, and experience all have their part to play, but the authority of double vision involves also a person's experience of the guidance of God. This, Oman says, is our sole reliable authority, to which alone we should wholly defer. In the shadow of the First World War, in a situation where moral laxity sapped the nation's vigor, when material greed undermined social righteousness and future catastrophe seemed round the corner, might God be at work all the same through a holy remnant, a ginger group of faithful men and women who witness to the truth, oppose evil, and work for human liberation. Oman acknowledged that those who themselves incarnated the prophetic message might be very few, but as there was no condition except the recognition of the truth itself, their fellowship was, in principle, universal. They revealed faith in a universal order of truth, righteousness, and mercy, which should direct all men and be served by all. He articulated this notion further in the Myrtle Lecture on the importance of the Apocalypse, which he delivered at the University of Aberdeen in 1932. This remnant would not fulfill their task of redeeming the world by violent reforms and rigid organizations, but by working for an end beyond our seeing and by might beyond our working, in which righteousness and not human schemes and prudences is our guide. He continues, there is a widespread belief, as in earlier time, that our present form of civilization is passing. There may be some vagueness about what the new order to which the old is to yield is to be. One thing is clear. It is man, not God, who is to fulfill himself in many ways. Might this yet be achievable through the church? The church that Oman had frequently castigated so severely for its materialism, its inwardness, its inability to address the spiritual problems either of an industrial society or of returning soldiers and their families. His New Year message as moderator in 1932 speaks optimistically of a change which has taken place in the whole student community, a change of interest from the material to the spiritual. There's still no lack of criticism of the church, but it's because of the sense that a more spiritual, effective society is the first of the world's needs. And among churches, he adds, it is possible to speak hopefully of our own. God's elect are called in Christ for the fulfillment of his purpose, which is not merely a better, but a new world. I conclude now with a parable which Oman gave to us in Grace and Personality. He's talking about grace, but he could also be talking about God's ways more generally. God does not conduct his rivers like arrows to the sea. The ruler and compass are only for finite mortals who labor by taking thought to overcome their limitations and are not for the infinite mind. The expedition demanded by man's small power and short day produces the canal. But nature, the work of a more spacious and less precipitate mind, produces the river. Why should we assume that in all the rest of his ways he rejoices in the river, but in religion can use no adequate method save the canal? Oman's reaction to the different ways in which profound experiences of life became integrated into his thought, sometimes a long and meandering period of time, sometimes more immediately, led eventually to a rich and powerful message, not only to his church in his own day, but a message of prophecy to our own time.
I feel sure there will be some reactions and responses and questions that people might like to bring to Fleur. So, is there anybody who feels inspired to start us off?